You're listening to VerySpatial Podcast, episode 754, February 5th, 2025.
Hello and welcome to a VerySpatial Podcast. I'm Jesse.
I'm Sue.
I'm Barb.
And this is Frank.
Yeah, so I don't know if this is news or this is housekeeping. It is the current state of the world. So I'll just say that if you are a person who uses U.S. data, especially from federal data sources, and if you do need those data sources, then you should go and download them. They're probably gone, but you can try to see if they're still there. Many are going offline. If it's anything to do with environmental justice or social justice or DEI or climate change, or we can keep going down the list. Yeah, they're offline. You might be able to find other sources. So a lot of the data is being collected in cooperation with universities or other organizations. So you may be able to find it on other sites. And a lot of historic data, of course, you can go to places like ArcGIS Online or state repositories where they made duplicate copies of it. But it's, yeah.
Yeah, just so many very dedicated, brave, and really trying hard workers within the federal government, within partnering agencies, scholars and all that are trying to, do what they can.
I'll say that this is one of the times that it kind of benefits us that private organizations and nonprofits are just have been pulling data from official sources and then doing sort of value added, because that in itself ends up being a record of the information. I didn't confirm it, but I saw that tiger lines, for example, were down from census. That obviously is in pretty much all the Esri data sets that you can connect to. It's also in OpenStreetMap. So it's good that these things are being replicated in other places. So it is a nice benefit of this data being out there and so free for so long that when these type of disruptions, for lack of a better word, occur, there are other places that you can get the information in what we, honest to goodness, hope is the short term.
And this is something I think the geospatial community, we've been talking about, not this situation, but when other things have happened where data has not been as readily available that was openly available, to have other repositories to download and back up. So it is almost a trial by fire of, some of the things that the geospatial community has been talking about worldwide. So the National Honor Society for Geospatial Technology has their applications open. This is Gamma Sigma Theta, and it is open to undergraduates, graduates, faculty, and alumni. And then students in the Honor Society receive benefits from all the partners with the National Honor Society. And this includes the Geospatial Professionals Network, formerly ASPRS, the GIS Certification Institute, and Drone Deploy.
I really hope they get their own website at some point in time, because the story map is usable, but it's got some issues in terms of being comfortable with it. It's the fourth semester. There we go. Fourth semester. The original semester was, of course, then fall of 2023. That was the first semester that GST, Gamma Sigma Theta, was out and available. I'm looking on the website and seeing if it's still in the free introductory period, and I don't see anything explicit about fees this semester. So it seems then that we are still in that introductory period where they're not assessing any fees for membership. So you apply as long as you meet the qualifications, which is, I believe it's a 3.3 GPA and a certain percentage of your class if you're a student of undergraduate, graduate status, and you're in. And so take advantage of it while it's free.
So do you have to apply to a chapter? So does your university have to have a chapter for you to be a member? There
are not chapters, but you cannot apply as an individual. You need to talk to a faculty member at your university, because a faculty representative of the students has to be the one who submits everybody's all at one time. So yeah, if you're interested in Gamma Sigma Theta, same thing. If you're also interested in geography in general, Gamma Theta Upsilon is the International Honor Society for Geography. That one does have a fee, but the same thing, you talk to your local chapter there because you might have a president or something like that for a local chapter, or your faculty representative, mentor, whatever, for GTU as well. So yeah, either way, if you're a student, graduate, undergraduate, talk to your faculty about becoming a member of one of these organizations.
And you have till April 13th to get the stuff in, I think.
Yeah,
Isn't that
the
right?
faculty mentor has until
Gotcha.
April to submit it. So you should get it to them at least a few days early.
Yeah, which means that you need to get it in
Before then.
You can't turn it in the night before they have to turn it in. Let's just
Yes, because we do
make that
have to
very
check to
clear.
make sure that you are eligible before
And-
we can submit it on to. And it is a hard deadline. It's not like April 13th-ish. It's April 13th at 7 p.m. Eastern. And if it's not in by then, that's it. Nobody else is getting in for that semester.
And they do recommend like a process, like the faculty could interview you or something like that. So it's listed. So the faculty evaluation piece is substantial. It takes some time. So do allow for that. I'd be thinking March is what I'm saying to get it to the faculty.
I'm not as many hoops, and it's a small department anyway. So in terms of the number of people who are coming to ask to be in it, I had my first one today who just kind of stopped by and said, "Hey, are we doing GTU this semester?" I'm like, "Yes, I'll put you on the list and see if you are eligible." But yeah, I'd say, by the beginning of April, you're probably safe. But yes, if you want to be really, really safe, especially big departments, March is good. Yeah. The key is the 3 classes. So you do have to have 3 geospatial technology classes. And so we kind of have, for some students, as long as they're taking classes that include geospatial technologies, we don't necessarily require it to be a geospatial technology explicit heavy class, as long as it has a good bit of it in there. So for instance, right now, my weather and climate class, we have a good 5-6 exercises that are going to be an ARC or something else like that are using geospatial technologies of some sort. And so I would include that as an example. Okay. Either way, moving on to the last piece of news.
Penn State has been using QR codes to follow honeybees to basically determine their pathways and where they go. It's pretty neat way to do this. They had QR codes on honeybees that then had sensors that detected where they went between some Pennsylvania and New York and 6 hive spots in order to get a better understanding of how they're collecting pollen and nectar and what they're doing since they're endangered.
I don't know, it was like 6 years ago or something. We had a faculty who was putting together an apiary, and she wanted us to use drones to follow the bees.
That would be challenging.
That's an understatement. And of course, it would have an impact on the bee's flight itself, depending on how close you were. So yeah, there's a lot to be said. So this is a much more elegant solution than the person who came and talked to me.
I think a very time-intensive but very, more elegant solution. They were able to identify individual bees and each individual.
I wonder how many people got stung when they would see the bees and look over, like random people. What is on that bee? What is that? And then I'm just saying.
Reminded me of May Po Kwan, but with honeybees.
And that's it for the news.
So this week, I wanted to chat a little bit about something that I return to on occasion, and not too long ago I did, and that is, I think for all of us, and by the way, not just geographers or GIS people or any of that, but anybody, right? Return back to some of the sort of, to us, books, scholarly works, whatever, that really resonated with us, and our stuff that kind of come back to, right? And then there's tons of stuff that maybe we've read or things we thought, but there's always a few that really, really spoke to us. And so I thought it'd be great to kind of just talk about some of those and just see. And for me to kind of kick it off, the one that I just came back to yet again was Jay Appleton's, his experience of landscape. So he wrote tons of stuff, but so that was the one, and first had to read it in graduate school and studying cultural landscape and stuff, but kept coming back to it. And the seminal part of that, his work, and he expounded it in others, was the idea of prospect refuge theory. And the reason why it resonates with me, among a lot of other great things I've read, is that I had never really thought of how I myself or maybe others viewed landscape, right, and inhabiting it. And so prospect refuge, unless somebody else wants to kick in kind of with the definition, is essentially the idea that people have sort of innate urges, innate reactions to environment. And two of those reactions are how you see kind of yourself out in the world. And the idea of prospect is that you have a need or feel a need to be able to see around you, right? To potentially see threats, right? To see and make sense of the world. And the converse of that is refuge, the idea that maybe you're in a safe space, a closed-in space where not quite hiding, but maybe threats can't see you. And so I'm kind of simplifying it down, and these things have been expounded on and kind of stuff. But so anyway, so prospect versus refuge. And so if you just think of prospect as I have a wide view, and refuge is more, closed in, maybe safe. And it's interesting because you can look at so many things. And yes, we don't, you don't want to necessarily just reduce it down to that, but as a starting off point to think, well, why do I react to things this way? And you can think for it anywhere from looking at artworks to, you can see it in how people, whereas I started working with it, like how people frame shots in movies. I was actually looking at it in a video game worlds class, so looking at video game landscapes. But anyway, I just got to thinking that this book has been around for a long time, but I just keep coming back to it. In fact, I think Justin and I were talking about this. I think it was published in 1975, which is 50 years ago this year.
I don't actually know that book, of that theory. It's kind of interesting to me. One of the more interesting dimensions about this conversation is I suspect the overlap between the four of us will be not large. And to the one that's definitely resonates the most with me is Futuan Space and Place. Like that I go back to all the time, is thinking about that was a very profound change for me, because I spent most of my time in my professional career in GIS dealing with space in some form or fashion. And I was in political science originally. And in political science, it's much more, it fashions itself a bit more as a more objective view on social phenomena. That's an overbroad generalization, but it tends to think in a little more in those terms. So Space and Place was profound for me, because it said, we have all that stuff, this objective things, but we also have all the subjective things, and they're very important, arguably more important, more defining for what we understand as humanity. And that was like turning the cube around from a completely different angle, that I was like, oh, good Lord, I didn't think you could look at it from that direction. So for me, that's one that I constantly feel myself referencing to, not necessarily, pulling the book out and reading it and saying Futuan said this, Futuan said that, but the concepts and the ideas within that is one that I pull back to. While Sue was talking, I was actually looking at our bookcase trying to make sure I had the right name, but Tim Cresswell did Place, an introduction, and it's a lesser version of that for me. I'm not saying it's a lesser book by any stretch of imagination. It's a different way of thinking about place as well, but it is what I read second. So it wasn't quite as profound, but it still does. Those two books embody the notion of place and how that was a profound change for me. And it really does enter as being almost my origin point for geography. I think about it in those terms very strongly when I think about geography.
I feel a little bit like we're in an oral exam, because I'm like, do I have the name right? I find myself in everyday life referring Eleanor Ostrom and the modifiable aerial uniproblem, the MOP, because it just surprisingly appears just out of nowhere all the time. And people don't think about what it is, or until you explain what it is, they don't realize, what's occurring. And because it's hard for us to recognize that in the world, and we understand it cognitively once we hear what the term is. So that's one of the works that I think about. I'm like, oh, surprisingly, it's very useful to bring out.
And so whenever we look at these, I counter Frank in his statement that he thought there would be very little overlap, because in reality, we're looking at things that have a significant overlap. So far we have 2 from the 70s, 2 very much driven by experience, 3 explicitly talking about landscape. What year was the MOP book? Was that early 80s? I forget. And so we've got experience, we've got landscape. Mine, because of my dissertation, I'm not going to say this is the end all be all, but back again 50 years ago, we have this edition of Tadahiko Higuchi with the original Japanese works that were eventually translated in the 80s to visual spatial structure of landscape. So, we have this binding of landscape across all the books. And this one, again, 3 of them in the 70s tied to experience heavily, and then one looking a little bit more at that. I don't know. Did you not walk away from political science? Did you hold on to that?
Well, yeah.
That scientific.
We've got to.
There is an overlap. There's an overlap.
I mean, when you say you, do you mean me or do you mean Barbara? Because I think the 2 of us have different takeaways.
Yeah, Barb also has that sustainability, sustainable resources, things like that background as well. So I think that would appeal.
Journalism.
And journalism.
Yeah, the other one, which is going to be something that I go to for fun, which is I have a book. I'd have to look up. I can see it in my eye. It's a paperback. It's a map of London streets, and it's literally just maps of London streets with the history of each building and then the people that live there in like an almanac. It's very relaxing. It would be nice if they had something like that for everywhere.
Even though, again, we might have a really broad background in things, if there's certain things that resonate more with us, we just keep coming back to them. And so I use, even if I use it as a jumping off point, I find that that's a way to often approach explaining to others, for me to say, this is why we want to understand experience and attachment. So, by the way, another Yi-Fu Tuan, a very famous work that feeds into this topophilia, right, attachment to place. But to try to explain how we might understand what it is that maybe is connecting with people on a deeper level. And so the prospect refuge idea, right? The reason why it resonates with me is not so much that this is a be-all, end-all to understand things. It's that it's a way to explain to others, to approach and say, look, here's a way somebody's trying to figure out what it is about certain landscapes that people might feel affinity for, might feel more comfortable in or have an emotion regarding, right? So that the idea, and often too, right, you see things in contrast to each other. And so one of the images that I show is the very famous painting, or is it The Wanderer or whatever, the dude standing on the rock looking out over the vast expanse, right? And it brings emotion. Or looking at a landscape painting, right, where you just see across this open space, versus maybe looking at something darker and more closed in. And maybe, some might say, well, even that it's not a refuge, right? So you might have people that react against maybe those ideas. So some people out in the open might feel exposed, for example. So it's even a jumping off point to say, do you agree with this? And to get people talking about it, right? So this is so when Appleton, came up with this, he's trying to understand these various things, but maybe it's a jumping off point to say, well, how comprehensive or how valid is that, right? Because there are plenty of people who don't like to be out in the open, for example, or plenty of people who are in a space that might feel safe and maybe somewhat closed in actually feel uncomfortable that way, right? They feel trapped. So I think that what I was kind of thinking about with coming back to some of these ideas is why do I come back to this particular one, and what is it that I think I can, not only for myself but for others kind of show.
So everyone here, and I think in the audience, people are going, you're wrong. And you're right. It was another O author. It's Stan Openshaw from 1984.
Oh, Openshaw, yeah.
Okay.
For the mop. And I got my O names mixed up because I felt put on the spot and didn't have notes. And I was like, it's an O name, So like them both, but yeah, it's Stan Openshaw that did the modifiable aerial uniprodel.
So, you had an interesting question. Did you take anything from political science? And I'm going to talk about something that's the anti version of what you're saying, is that there were a lot of things in political science that I was like, well, wait a minute, that doesn't match my experience or things that I've observed or what I've gone through or I've watched others go through. So I don't understand how this body of literature can kind of get at these conclusions. One of the ones that was a big revelation, I think Barbara would have called, maybe she still does, I think she still does, would call herself in political science terms an institutionalist, the belief in institutions and their ability to do things and their own bodies of existence. And it's a whole thing in political science discourses, that idea about institution. There's also this other theory called the garbage can theory, that talks about policy formation. And it's this notion that when you ask policymakers, how did you decide this particular policy would come to the top, bubble to the top instead of all these others, this particular solution instead of all these others? And they said, look, this stuff kind of just shows up in like a garbage can almost model. We just kind of pick stuff out of the garbage can that just hits for that day. I'm simplifying a lot of this, but that's essentially the garbage pail theory of policy. And that's why these things get picked. And I was livid when I was listening to this in the class, because I was like, that is a load of garbage, no pun intended there, given the theory, because I just spent a year of my life trying to advocate for policy and trying to get these things within the geospatial realm, within the state of West Virginia, trying to get these things to the surface. And I'm like, no, it's not just some random thing you happen to find on the shelf. It's, if the right voices get the right volume, then they just get more prominence in the decision matrix. And so I got very frustrated so the garbage pail theory has been very revelatory to me in the sense of, I don't feel it's holistic. And it's also not a term I heard at all in political science, of positionality. It is a function of positionality. If you go and ask staffers for policymakers, how does the policy come to, to bubble to the top, to run with it? Their point of view completely ignores all the stuff that happens before that actually happens. So in the moment, that may not really be even writing down what it is, how they picked it or whatever. But I felt like what you chose to study, the scale, to use geography terms, that they chose to study dictated the theory and how that performed. When I was like, no, wait, no, there's a whole lot of stuff that goes before that got ignored. So it was the lack of holisticness. So that one actually sticks with me a lot, because when I do approach things, I go, what am I missing in the process by what I'm studying, what I'm looking at, what I'm exploring, that I'm not seeing because where I chose to enter the stream of analysis.
I'll jump into the non-geography examples as well, which mine kind of overlaps a little bit on the inter-site level as opposed to intra-site level. But from an archaeological perspective, the book What This All AWL Means was one of those that for archaeology began to set up a new way of providing discourse. It was a book that provided a traditional discussion of an archaeological site, but then the next chapter would lay out a humanizing factor, creating an experience, telling a story around these artifacts that were being found at this site. And a lot of it centering around an awl and how it was being used day to day, and how it eventually made its way from the source material to being curated to finding its way eventually into the refuse of the site. Going back and forth, one chapter, traditional archaeology discussion and methodologies, one chapter story, one chapter discussion and methodologies. And we've seen that a lot since then, especially in things like landscape experience books and articles that kind of do that as well. But this is one of the ones that I read first. I'm not sure if there were a lot before that, but it just, kind of struck home for me. Not in the counter way that the book that Frank was just talking about made him wonder about his reality. No comment on Frank's existential crisis.
It is interesting way to reframe the question that Sue had. It is I want to say an anti one or an inverse one. I don't know what the word is, but it is kind of interesting. And I think there's a lot I learned in political science that did give me in opposition to things that were going on in geography in terms of philosophical approaches, not, necessarily ontology, epistemological level of philosophy, but, kind of.
How do you actually make the bread work?
Yeah. And a lot of that, it did have a profound impact on the way that I think about a lot of how we think about geography. And so, I have a master's degree in national relations, and a lot of the IR theory is very grounded in the person, which, like, leadership theory is really complicated, because when you're looking at it, it's very hard to make political science theory around singular events with singular people at a single point in time, and historians would rightfully so come in and say, wait a minute, you're really talking about history and history processes and theories and that sort of stuff. So that bit also made me kind of bring in the geography to go, wait, yeah, we are trying to come up with systemic understanding that maybe could happen, but if you're starting from the basis of data and data points, you don't got enough. So maybe you're attacking it wrong is what I'm saying. You're using the wrong tool set.
Well, I think too, I mean, as I'm kind of listening, and one of the things that for me and kind of getting into this discussion is maybe you don't know until later, like when people recommend books to read or things like that, or maybe even a movie to watch or something, you can't really know the impact, but it's interesting, right? If things really made a difference for you for whatever reason, right? Whether you agreed with something, disagreed with something, those choices, right? And all of us are educators in some way, right? Those choices can sometimes really help somebody else understand whatever concept that it enlightened you with, or again, be a jumping off point, especially if you have a strong reaction. There's things that I've read. I won't name works, but I can remember when I was doing historical archaeology, there were two things that I was asked to read, and I just disagreed with them vehemently of their framework, just because they were trying really hard to convince you that this particular model of analysis was the way to go. And every painful twist they made to try to pin down their stuff to fit into the model just made it like that much more painful. And so I remember those for that, right? That said, look, whatever I do, I'm not gonna try to force this into this rigid model. But I think that thinking about why someone asked you to read things, or why you gravitated towards something, I think is really good, because then you have to make a decision, like what will I tell people that I think they should try. And I'll give an actual, not a scholarly article, but I can remember it was actually in a history class. We had to read a book called The Leopard, and The Leopard was actually made into a movie decades ago. But The Leopard was a novel about the disintegration kind of the old order in Europe, and the rise of, post-industrial stuff in the 19th century. And I had never really thought about like some of those ways that you could capture that in a microcosm until I read that book. But I would never in a million years on my own have picked that up. But yet I still remember some parts of that, like how the characters embodied kind of the old traditions. That you had the new industrialists, that kind of thing. So they were archetype kind of in a way. But anyway, that was another example, because I've often asked if anybody else had read that, and they're like, what?
So, Sue, this is an example of this in action. My father sent me a copy of The Leopard when he sent me a bunch of vintage map books, thinking of me. And it's sat on my shelf and I haven't read it yet. And now I'm going to. And I have to say it goes both ways. I remember the feeling I had when Dr. De Clerica, who's big in political science, I was reading a book from geography. It was actually the ghost map. And I told him, I really enjoy this. And he asked to borrow the copy to read it. And I just felt so good that like he was interested. He thought something that I was reading and explained was worthwhile.
Probably the book though that I reference the most in my teaching, certainly in my teaching. I'm teaching photography this semester, and I'm definitely referencing it in one form or the fashion, is How to Lie with Maps. It's a seminal book in geography, but I do ask myself, from the moment I discovered this book existed, and I was very familiar with the concept of how to lie with statistics before that ever, but for the moment that I read that book, or read pieces of that book, because I ended up reading pieces here and there, and then ultimately reading the whole thing in parts. The moment that connected with me, I started asking myself, what am I lying about in my map? And is that okay? Is it purposeful? Which of course led to the overreaching, what story you're trying to tell, what is the thing you're trying to communicate, the important things in what I think are the important things in cartography. But that was very critical to my thinking about, even running a report, whereas before it'd be like, these are the data and what it showed. Now I'm going, well, okay, I picked this data and I picked to run those numbers, and I didn't pick run these other numbers, and I didn't write about why I didn't pick these other numbers. Those things, I'm presenting a point of view, and that has an inherent, point of view. I don't want to say bias, but arguably yes, bias. And because I'm doing that, I need to be cognitive of it to either minimize it or acknowledge that I'm not telling a piece of the story, or, I have to be careful, cognitive of that, I think. And that is something that was very profound for me about how to lie with maps. And I think it's something that's why it's in every damn geography program that you should read this book, because it is so profound. But it's very interesting to me that I haven't read that book in years, but I do go back to its concepts almost every map I make.
And along with what everyone's been saying, I was thinking about it's the right book at the right time. I remember when I was struggling in my studies, and Dr. Marta stopped by with a book that he had enjoyed when he was in, I don't know if it was undergraduate or graduate, and he sat there and he opened the book and he wrote in the flap that he believed that I would be able to graduate. And also it means I can never get rid of it out of my library. But he did. He said, in this book, I'm writing this because I believe that, you can do this. And so I think there's a lot of power in that mentorship.
And sometimes those ones are mundane books that never really won any awards or anything like that. But again, they were the right time. And I can remember a history book when I had to teach history when I was in grad school for that. It was simply just a book on the causes of the First World War. But it was a book that laid them out and summarized them, and it was meant to be kind of a concise guide. And I still remember, and I'm like, you know what? That's got it laid out for me, all of the complex things that were going on, and we all know, like, the arms race and all the intertwining alliances and all that kind of stuff. But even like books like that, right, can resonate with you later because they helped you understand a topic, and it was the way they did it, not necessarily the topic itself, that made them useful or stick with you and say, yeah, that's something I could go back to understand.
There was an historian. She was kind of a popular historian, blanking on her name, Catherine something maybe. She wrote a book about life in a medieval village, for example. That was one of the historian books that she did, and she did one about World War I think. And I can't remember all of them, but I found her like you. I found her approach to writing about this stuff to be an amazingly revelatory thing, because all the history books I had read before that were just dry tombs of history, and you kind of had to get the exciting bits out of it. And I liked it. I enjoyed it. I've always been a huge fan of history. I have a minor in it, so I did a lot of history classes, but it was you had to fight for it to really get to it. But when I started reading her books, I was just like, I just enjoy reading this. Like I enjoy reading a novel because it takes you through so many great things. And I know I know a lot of historians have had problems with him as an historian, but the gentleman who wrote Band of Brothers, I can't remember his name. He took that even further, and he had a very similar style. And then Barbara mentioned the Ghost Map book and the about the Jon Snow and the London maps. Again, the style of that makes a very engaging story, and it's an interesting way to approach communicating information. And I think it's part of the reason that I've always really appreciated those who can push scholarship in a way that you don't need a PhD to really get, that intrigue me the most. So I don't know how to do it. I'll be the first to admit, but I do find that style very compelling, and it did change me a lot too.
Was it Catherine Hanley?
I think that sounds right. I can picture the top of the book of the edition I had for the one in Life in a Medieval Village or something like that, but I cannot remember her name.
Okay. Kind of wrapping up the conversation. We'll let the Dr. Bergeron completely wrap us up, but I think one of the things to note is that almost all the books that we talked about are as old or older than we are. And that's because they became kind of part of the disciplines that we were in a little bit before we got to them. And so the people who were teaching us, our mentors, passed them on to us. And so now the books that we're talking about, some of them are the same books, but other ones are ones that build on the books that we've been talking about and take us new places, and hopefully, convey new ideas as well to those who are reading.
Just to kind of wrap up, I think it was a great conversation, but it's just interesting how some of those things, often from our background, how we use them as touchstones. We use them as ways to get others, to maybe think about the things we were thinking about, and And so there are many, and I'm sure there's tons for you out there of examples. And honestly, it doesn't always have to be a book or an article or something like that. But those are the ones for us in education, right? That we're trying to transmit our background, our knowledge to others and get them to maybe see and ask questions. And so that was what all started with the Prospect Refuge, because I felt that this is a theory, right? That's easy. Well, not easy, maybe not the right word, but it's one that people can understand, right? Even if they don't agree with it or they want to, modify it or do things, is they can understand the concept of it fairly straightforward. And so that was one of the reasons why I liked it.
Yeah, it starts as a very simple idea, and then the book builds through
exactly
the various ways you can expand this, and it becomes more in depth as you go through it. But you can start with that first couple of
and
chapters,
to examine it, right? To
is.
critically examine it. Like, what do you think of this? So anyway, I thought that was a great discussion, though, and maybe we'll have to revisit it with different things that resonate with us. But
some heads up on what the comp questions are going to be beforehand.
Yeah, and it's funny how both you and Bart mentioned that too, because it does take me back to that. But I tended to use examples of books that really, for me, right, I could talk about because they did have an impact on me. And
it's interesting. I think we should have a follow-on discussion, because I actually talked a lot more about ideas, and I don't necessarily remember the books or even the author in a lot of ways. Like, so there's things that I can say I didn't mention because I know there's this concept, another concept, they were profound, but I don't remember who wrote it, when they wrote it, where they wrote it. So, I'm a bad scholar in that regard.
On to the Events Corner. As always, we encourage you to check out these events and others. GeoBusiness will be taking place the 4th and 5th of June in London in the UK.
RGS IBG is taking place August 26th through 29th in Birmingham. Abstracts are due by March 7th.
GISPro, which is a great conference if you get a chance to go, is October 6th to the 9th in Denver, Colorado, but abstracts are due by May 5th, and please, you should present. It's a great place.
Geography 2050, so from the American Geographical Society, will be taking place November 20th and 21st in New York City.
If you would like us to add your event to podcast, send us an email to podcast@veryspatial.com.
If you'd like to reach us individually, I can be reached at sue@veryspatial.com.
I can be reached at barb@veryspatial.com.
And you can reach me at frank@veryspatial.com.
Of course, if you'd like to reach any of us, you can head over to veryspatial.com/contacts, and of course, me at KindaSpatial.
As always,
we're the folks from Very Spatial.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you in a couple weeks.
I guess this is what drowning looks like. In waves of people sending good vibes. I'm not alone. I have someone at home who stayed up waiting to tell me good night. I'm a student day, good night. Kiss me then please turn off the lights. No, I shouldn't complain. A good day stay the same, but I'm drowning in a wave of good vibes. I wanna be better, and you'll make it better. Hold me together long enough to be better. My bed and your sheets, your clothes and my feet. When it's just you and me, I should be better. One day I hope to find the surface, but therapy just makes me nervous. So I waste good days having nothing to say, even when you call to say I'm worth it. The same thing every day, you're worth it. Baby, we will make it through this. No, I shouldn't complain. That good days stay the same, but I'm drowning